Hi, we continue and fit complete today Genesis 29 as we move into one of the longest scenes in the entire Hebrew Bible where only women are present in the conversation. So before we enter into that, just a few things to catch us up on where we are. If you haven't watched the introductory video to this whole section of 28:11 to 31:55, I really encourage you to do so, where we've gone over some of these things in more detail. So to situate ourselves, we're right here, almost at the center of this unit of the Jacob and Laban unit, which is surrounded, of course, by the Jacob and Esau units that we saw already with the blessing and birthright, and then we'll see what follows with the reunion. And as we've been reading this at least these three levels, and all three are relevant for our immediate story here. The immediate plot of Jacob escaping from his angry brother in search of a woman, and now he has two women. He only wanted Rachel, but he's got two, and now we're going to see them battle over with each other over having children. We also see two nations are in your womb, back from the oracle that Rebekah received back in chapter 25, that Jacob would become a nation and Esau would become a nation. And as we know, Jacob will become the nation Israel and Esau will become the nation Edom. And Jacob becoming the nation Israel is in the process of being conceived right here. It will come to be when he's renamed Israel on the way back, as we'll see, or on his way to Esau, as we'll see in a couple of chapters. But that's certainly present throughout here, and we're going to look at that in some detail. But it's also connected with the post-exilic question, not so much of Josiah, as we looked at in chapter 28, but of the relationship with the old country, with Babylon, and not only with their people in terms of who you can marry in intermarriage, but in terms of what kind of society we're going to be. And so we can even look right now, I was going to look at it later, but we can even look right now at the questions that are implicit in our passage. They're never explicit, but they're certainly understood in the background. Two primary questions. What makes us the people of Yahweh/Elohim? And I put it that way because our particular passage today is framed with Yahweh but as Elohim throughout. So you can attribute that to sources, but the section fits together so tightly that there's no need to resort to the expedient of sources. We can see that the authors of the final text certainly were willing to speak of God in both terms. And we see a whole series of these, and it's worth just noting these, if you're not familiar with them, as the options for what make the people of Yahweh what they are. Originally, of course, the Sinai covenant, with Exodus and the people in the wilderness and the Ten Commandments and all that, and the promise to obey. And that, with the people who keep the covenant, as described in Exodus and in the exilic or post-exilic text of Leviticus, makes them the people of Yahweh. But after exile, we see both in Jeremiah and Ezekiel the question of a new covenant written on the heart, not just on the tablets that Moses brought down, but a new, more intimate covenant with each person as part of the whole. But remaining out there, especially in the book of Zechariah, is the promise of Davidic monarchy. And that's what makes the people who they are. And as I've been noting throughout Genesis, there are many parallels with the David and monarchy story in general. And I've been showing in this particular section how Laban and his daughters can be read as an allegory of the monarchy against monarchy. And I'll show an element of that as we go. So that's certainly an element. And we know that stayed as long as up to the 1st century, when the son of Joseph is also described as the son of David. The prevailing one, at least the one that prevailed politically, is the Ezra-Nehemiah one, that we are who we are by obeying the Persian king and the law of Yahweh, and by having no intermarriage with the quote-unquote people of the land, which is to say broadly the Canaanites, but really anybody whose names are not on the official lists that Nehemiah and Ezra bring with them in carrying out the Persian king's call to reestablish Jerusalem as a Persian colony. But what we see is differently than all those, for the first time here, is descent from Jacob, that they would become, as we'll see in Genesis 49, the first time in the Bible, at least in this chronological sequence, of the 12 tribes of Israel as a designation. And so this is the time we're going to see one child at a time of these sons coming, and then we'll see a little later, and I'll show it in our video in a moment, how that plays out, not just as the family stories here, as Westerman notes, but in the tribal stories we see in chapter 49. The other question is, how is society organized? And again, following the Ezra-Nehemiah as an element of what I call elsewhere the religion of empire, it's hierarchical and patriarchal. So there the women are accused of being the cause of sin, leading their men astray, and it's hierarchical in the sense that the king and the elite control, and they tell what the ordinary people what to do. And they make clear that anybody who's a foreigner or married to a foreigner is not allowed to be part of this rebuilt community. That's very contrary to what we would see in texts like here in Leviticus, where the society is organized around priests and people in general. And what we see here in Genesis is it's going to be egalitarian, where there's no sense of any hierarchy within the tribes of Israel as the sons of Jacob. So notice in each of these three, there's a mythical son question. The sons of Aaron here, the sons of Jacob here. And although Ezra Nehemiah never mentions sons of David, David is certainly mentioned there in the background as a source of some future monarchy sometime after Persia. And of course that idea still maintains for centuries, as I noted, up to the time of Jesus. So we're going to see how what Genesis is introducing here in the exilic or post-exilic period is a whole new way of understanding who the people of Yahweh are. So again, as we've been going through this, we've looked at those three elements, and we've also been noting, and just in passing, I won't look at it in great detail today, of how Spolstra shows how our whole unit here is both parallel to and an inversion of the wife-sister stories we saw in Genesis 12, 20, and 26. And this is posted at radicalbible.net, so you can see those there as well. We've also been looking, as I noted, at the parallels here with Laban and his daughters, and although there's no particular element in our verses now, we're going to see momentarily that Rachel demanding sons is parallel to Hannah at the very beginning of the monarchy story demanding sons. And we'll also see how in both situations the sons are symbolic not only of the tribes, obviously here, but perhaps also of monarchy and the demand for kings, at least on this side, on the monarchy side of this. So as we've been also looking here at the shape, and today we move into this section which forms its own chiasm right here in a 5-part chiasm, and I set out the key words to set out those pieces of the chiasm, as I'll show you in a minute. But as you can see in my note down here, scholars have also organized this in other ways, and part of that is because 12 is a multiple of 2 and 3 and 4 and 6, so it can be divided a whole series of ways. So Falkman sees it as 3 parts of 4 children each in these little units, whereas Wenham here sees 2 groups of 3 scenes. So 4 boys and then 2 and 2, and then this dialogue in there. So it's certainly able to be read in several different ways because it's very stylized in this sequence. And there are many things that are missing here in this story, as we'll see. For example, chronologically, it's utterly unclear of exactly what's going on in terms of this in relationship with what we saw previously. If we go back up the verse, we hear that Jacob went into Rachel, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served Laban for another 7 years. So that's the 14 to the 21 years. But is what's happening here after that? Is this after the 21 years? Or is it after the 14 and during this 7 years? Or is it perhaps before that? That the Leah pregnancies are in the first 7 years before Rachel. It's utterly unclear of what the timing is of this. And throughout, it's stylized in a way that each of the women, both Leah and Rachel, and not Bilhah and Zilpah, who bear children for Jacob through them, but they speak words of naming and their feelings about what's going on, but who are they speaking to? There's no apparent audience. So it's a very stylized scene, as we'll see. Not meant to provide realistic plot, but to provide a stylized expression of the relationship between the women and setting up the story of the tribes, as we'll see. So let's look at our keywords for a bit here, and I've highlighted everything except the names of the people, because we'll see I put that in another place. The names of the children. I put certainly the names of all the adult actors here. And we see how, not surprisingly, the words are all around bearing children. So conceived and bore and bearing are throughout. But notice the repetition 3 times here of maidservant Zilpah, and similarly the maidservant Bilhah up here as well, 3 times for each one, highlighting that. And then the rivalry between the sisters that we'll see down here around the mandrakes when we get to that part. Framed by God remembered Leah, Yahweh remembered Leah here. It doesn't say remembered, but opened her womb, heard her, and opened her womb. And here God remembered Rachel and heard her and opened her womb. So framing that without preference to either one. But as we see as we start our story, it as Yahweh saw that Leah was unloved, literally hated is what the word means, and he opened her womb. And that's the only time in the Hebrew Bible that I could find that Yahweh is described as responding to that particular prompt. There's certainly plenty of other times that Yahweh responds, for example, at the end of Exodus 2, to the suffering of his people, and they're crying out, and to the people who are facing injustice, like we see in the Sodom story in Genesis 18 and 19, setting that up. But this is the only time I could find where this particular term here, senua, largely meaning hated, unloved is a polite way to put that, where Yahweh responds. So let's look more closely. I already showed that part here, and I already noted that Yahweh frames the narratives here. As Anderson wrote in his monograph on this, he says the disappearance of Jacob's name in these verses serves to highlight all the more the fact that God bears responsibility for the births. Or that, as well as the fact that the women are being highlighted on the scene here for the first time. As I've noted several times in the previous videos, Rachel is not described as having any response at all to all of what Jacob does, whether that's seeing her and loving her and kissing her, or wanting her as his wife, or being disappointed when he got her sister, or waiting all these years. We've not heard a word from her throughout this whole time. So we see the opening here is like we saw with Sarai and Hagar back here, but not on the same basis. So you open her womb here, Rechem, which we've seen once before, and we'll see it another time in our scene here, framing the chiasm, other side of the chiasm. But Rachel was barren, joining with her sisters in the generations, with Sarah and Rebekah, and nowhere else in Genesis. And as my note below has, if we read this through the monarchy allegory, it can suggest that while unloved Leah, who's the mother of Judah, as I'll show in just a moment, has sons, kings, for example, David and Solomon, Rachel, as Israel, does not, later parallel to Hannah. And while I'm on that, why don't I move here to this 12 tribes chart, which is a little more complicated than it looks more complicated than it really is, and so let me explain it, and hopefully that makes some sense. So on this first page of a 3-page chart here, you see the two passages I was noting where the offspring of Jacob are named. And here I've color-coded them according to their mothers here, so I put the ones from Leah here, and the ones that are Rachel's here, and then Leah's from Zilpah here, and then Rachel's here, and added the one from Benjamin, which is from chapter 35, way later, as you can see here. And I left out all the details of the descriptions. For the moment, I'm just trying to look at the names and not how they're described. We'll look at that more closely when we get to 49. But here is Jacob calling his sons and gathered around to tell you what will happen to you in days to come. So Jacob acting as a prophet. And we see them named in this order, and then the narrator adds, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said. Notice not the eponymous ancestors of the 12 tribes, but these are the 12 tribes. And so we also can see where 12 tribes is mentioned. And I want to note before I do that in my book, Come Out My People, I noted how rarely Genesis and its whole story is referred to throughout the monarchy story. So you can see here the reference to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob throughout those books, and how rare there is any mention throughout the monarchy story, highlighting my claim all along, as with most scholars, that Genesis is written later than the monarchy story. So when I noted earlier that Bodner was suggesting that Deuteronomy was taking scenes from ideas from Genesis, I'm suggesting here it's the other way around on this basis. So highlighting the fact that this whole image of the 12 tribes is a late concept. So we see it one time in Deuteronomy here, and only this one time. They're not described as tribes, it's just described as these names. 6 on one side for the blessing and 6 on the other side for the curse, without any sense of priority there. Then a listing in Joshua for the towns and pasture lands of what they'll get. And the Levites are described as not getting land, so they get land out of the others. So out of all these tribes, the Levites get places to be, and they're listed in this order. Then we have several places, 4 places in Numbers where they're listed. One for a man from each tribe shall be with you from the ancestral house, and they're listed in this order. Then a little later in Numbers, the standard of the camp, and so when they go out in military proceedings, so the order in which they go. And then when they go out to spy the land, people are sent out to be spies from this order of tribes. And then at the end of Numbers, there's a census of the people, echoing the census at the end of 2 Samuel, for which David is upbraided by Yahweh there. And we see the sequence here. So putting that all together, we get this. And I can make this a little bigger. I couldn't make those others bigger. And I color-coded each of the names so you can see how different the orders are. So we see in both Genesis, one's Reuben is first. But the point to highlight politically is that Judah is not first. Judah is the last child given birth by Leah. The other ones from Leah are through the other wife, the secondary woman, although she's not described as a Pelegesh, she's described as a wife. Through the one otherwise named as a maidservant, but not given as a maidservant, given as a wife, as we'll see in that scene. So in a totally different order here, but in both cases, Judah is just one in the bunch. There's no priority for Judah. Judah. And the reason that's important is that in the monarchy story, Judah is the starting place for David's monarchy, and then Israel says, we're your bone and flesh, and joins with Judah as the central place. And throughout the monarchy, Jerusalem in Judah is understood as the primary place where Yahweh lives, and that's the highlight of the monarchy, of Josiah's reform, and of the Ezra and Nehemiah rebuilding after exile, all built around the idea that Judah is the center and Jerusalem is the center in Judah. But Deuteronomy doesn't even have Judah in the center. Deuteronomy has Simeon, at the beginning. Deuteronomy has Simeon at the beginning. Joshua has Levi here for the reasons I was highlighting, because it's about Levi's land that is going to be taken from all the others, and then Judah is the first one there. But notice in the numbers, when only Judah is there once as the lead, and Reuben and Simeon following otherwise, but none of these are the order we see in Genesis. I'm not going to try to parse when Numbers is written by most scholarly accounts, and I'm no expert on Numbers. It's a pastiche of sources from various situations, and that's the book where I think that's most clear, where there's really not so much a plot, but a series of stories that is probably highlighting later issues around priestly rivalries and various things like that. But in any case, whether Numbers is from one source or many, there's no sense to harmonize anything here, except 3 out of the 4 times to have Reuben and Simeon first, but Judah's fourth here and third here, and the rest of them are not in the same order. So it did not seem important, to, as far as I can see, to these authors to highlight them in order, and certainly not to put Judah first as we go. So let's put up our keywords, and we'll just look at a few verses of our story today as it starts. So I already noted when Yahweh saw that Leah was here hated, and I note it's matched here in her response, and here it's translated hated. It's 150 times in the Masoretic text, and a couple other times we'll see in Genesis, once in the Joseph story, and once we saw earlier. He opened her womb, and it was noting Rechem here for womb, and we'll see it at the other side of it. But Rachel was barren. So Leah conceived and bore a son, and she named him Reuben. And here's Westerman's note on what I was saying there in terms of this set of naming being family reasons and the other set being tribal reasons. And scholars struggle a little bit over the style here. Westerman notes that these reasons for naming fall into 2 groups. There's a sentence in 2 parts that first states an action of God and second its consequence, always referring to the mother, and, quote, an artificial formation in which no real name-giving can correspond, the first part a name of praise carrying echoes of Psalms, and the second part applying the particular action of God to the mother's situation. And that's overall. But in our immediate situation, which I'll scroll down so we can see all of it, we see that in Judah's first 4 children, she names the first 3 in about trying to get Jacob to love her. But in the 4th one, she shifts. In the 4th one, she says, I will praise Yahweh. And so she turns it back to Yahweh and stops trying to get Jacob's affection through childbirth. And we note that she doesn't mention Rachel here. Rachel is out of sight, out of mind for her, but plainly not out of mind. She may be out of sight and out of voice, but plainly she's not out of mind, because this whole thing is flowing out of his love for Rachel and his lack of love for Leah. That is Jacob, not Yahweh, obviously. So she names the first one Reuben and the second one Simeon. It could mean hyena, although that seems an unlikely name for your child, especially in this context. It's probably more from herd, Shema or Shimon here, for a play on that. But again, we're not going to try to parse those, particularly as scholars have noted they don't always correspond. And the third time, she uses this phrase, now this time my husband will be joined to me, and provides a wonderful irony back to 2:23, where the same word pa'am, which literally means foot, but is a common euphemism for at this moment. Back in 22:23, we see the Adam says this, using pa'am, at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and this one shall be called woman. So they're joined together because they're one body, and here she's trying to get her husband to be joined to him, using a different word than we saw in the garden story, not directly, but over a son that she has from him. And we note that throughout this, we're assuming that Jacob is having sex with Leah, although we don't hear anything about that. We don't hear if there's any pleasure in this, and we don't hear a word about where Rachel is throughout this sequence of years. And plainly, these have to be at least 9 months, if not a year apart. So again, which time sequence is passing is not clear, and anything else that's going on in this time period is simply just left out. And then finally in the 4th one here, and my note is to connect back to what we see in the tribal descriptions and Jacob's closing scene there, she conceived and bore a son and said, this time I will praise Yahweh. using Oda here, again echoing in 49:8. As Wenham notes, has she at last come to terms with her plight? She may not enjoy her husband's affection, but God has given her 4 sons, and she must be thankful for that. Must she be thankful for that? Or is Wenham simply reinforcing the patriarchal notion that the purpose of women is to have children, and she should be glad for that? We've not seen that Leah was excited about having children for their own sake, and we don't hear her describing her love for these children. We hear her simply describing that if I have children, maybe my husband will love me, and this time she'll simply praise Yahweh. But we hear not a word for her about enjoying children or nursing them or anything, like we saw at least a passing reference to Sarah nursing Isaac back there in the first generation. So she praises Yahweh, naming him Judah, Yehudi, which literally means in later language the Jew. And this is the first time of 819 uses in the Masoretic text. As Rabbi Shea Held notes, who is a Jew? One who discovers the possibility of gratitude even amid heartbreak. And of course, that's a poetic way of saying it in contrast with all the various formal ways of saying it we see in the Bible. But this is the first time we're hearing any reference to a word that could be connected with a later sense of Jew, even though what is important in here is not going to be being Jewish, it's going to be Bnei Yisrael, the sons of Israel. So we'll continue when Rachel, finally watching this whole situation, and we note that it says she bore no children, so we learn now he must have been having sex with her also along the way. We'll see her response next time. See you for that. Bye-bye.